The Gilded Age is produced by Universal Television and brought to you by HBO of Warner Media. All characters, plot points, and footage are property of HBO. The Gilded Age is a brand new drama airing exclusively on HBO Max. Join your friends at Free Tours by Foot as we take you through New York City, showing you actual locations from the show, locations in New York City the show is based around, discuss plot points, and go over the actual history of all of the events of the Gilded Age. And remember to book your tour with freetoursbyfoot.com the next time you visit New York City or any one of our other locations. And now, on to Katherine.
So let's talk a little bit about Gladys, because this is really the first time that Gladys's story has played a significant part in one of the episodes. So the first thing I want to go over is they keep referencing in almost every episode now of the Gilded Age that, Gladys is really kind of struggling because she wants to become an adult. She wants to, and everybody keeps saying she should be out already. She should have come out already. And so I just want to clarify what it is they're talking about and why it was important and kind of what you're seeing as a result of that in the show right now. So coming out, in essence, meant a young woman who was entering adult society. Now, this was something that was a very big deal, especially for these upper class families in this time period. It meant not only was she ready to be invited to adult parties, adult dinners, and take part in adult society at the time, but more importantly, it meant that she was now eligible to start thinking about marriage. And so how one came out was typically with a ball or a party held in honor of this person who was coming out. And this is actually why Mrs. Russell says she has not allowed Gladys to come out yet. They've just moved into this house. She has not gotten where she wants to be or thinks she needs to be in society. And so in her mind, she's waiting so that Gladys is better positioned. You know the saying, you only get one first impression? That's kind of what she's holding off for. She wants Gladys's coming out to make a certain first impression because that's very much going to influence her marriage prospects. This is kind of how she's going to be seen by any potential suitors, is by what kind of coming out party does she have? Where is it held? What is her house like? And who is in attendance? Is she socializing with that very upper echelon of New York high society, which, as we've seen, Mrs. Russell's not quite there yet. She hasn't cracked it. And so she has been holding Gladys back from coming out. Now, sometimes I think it's hard as a modern person to look at this and get an accurate gauge of what age it is we're talking about here, because the modern assumption, I think, is 18, adulthood. And that's not necessarily the case, though they have not said how old Gladys is supposed to be in the show. But generally speaking, most girls actually came out a little earlier than that. Girls actually were sometimes coming out as early as 15 or 16. And the way they talk about Gladys, they make it sound as though, yes, she should have been out already, but like a year ago. So my assumption is Gladys is probably 17 or 18 years old, because in terms of that society at the time, they do need to start looking for a husband for her, because once a woman reached the age of, gasp, 30, she was an unmarriageable spinster. So a woman of Gladys's age really does need to start thinking about her future. And so you've seen Mrs. Russell kind of holding back. She won't let her come out. She doesn't want her to socialize with young men. And you've even seen in episode 5, the Russells have absolutely squashed Gladys's prospects with this suitor who seems very nice and seems to really like her. And it seems like they'd be pretty well suited. And it might be puzzling as to why they're rejecting him, because really on paper, he sounds like he wouldn't be a terrible prospect. His family clearly has money. They've referenced that they have a house in Newport. They're a part of society. You know, he's early in his career, but he has good prospects. He would be of generally the right social rank. But Mrs. Russell keeps saying, I want more. So for me, I think that what they're queuing up here is something that's very much based on history. If we go back to our history, I think that it's possible that Gladys's storyline is going to be end up being based on somebody named Consuelo Vanderbilt. Now, she was the daughter of Alva Vanderbilt. We've already talked about that embodiment of Gilded Age new money, the woman who actually had the audacity to go toe-to-toe with Mrs. Astor and triumphed. Her daughter was Consuelo. And she was absolutely determined that not only was she going to break into this upper echelon of New York high society, but she was going to maintain that status by her daughter's marriage. So for her, it wasn't enough that she married somebody very, very wealthy. It wasn't even enough that she married somebody of like an old Knickerbocker name, like we've talked about. She wanted her daughter to have a title. And this was something that was actually starting to be somewhat common at the time. If you're a fan of literature, I highly recommend you go and read the Edith Wharton novel. It was unfinished at the time of her death, but it's called The Buccaneers. And it's actually somewhat based on Consuelo Vanderbilt and other women like her. At this time, you had plenty of European aristocrats with old titles, old names, but who were essentially penniless. And they're trying to maintain these vast estates that are starting to crumble. What they needed was an influx of cash. Right at the same time, you have all of these American heiresses who are loaded with new money, but are not seen as being quite that upper echelon of high society. And so you have these penniless aristocrats marrying these very, very wealthy American heiresses. The woman brings the money, he brings the title and the prestige. And that's exactly what happened to Consuelo Vanderbilt. She was married off and actually really forced to marry the 9th Duke of Marlborough, a member of the Spencer Churchill family. Now, Consuelo was in love with somebody else, and actually the Duke of Marlborough was in love with somebody else. But Consuelo was, according to the stories, locked in her room until she agreed to go through with this marriage. Her mother sent word to her room that she was so sick over this that she was dying, and Consuelo finally relented. She had really lived under her mother's thumb for her entire life, very much what we're seeing with Gladys Russell and her mom. I'm sure this won't shock anybody, but the marriage of Consuelo Vanderbilt to somebody she did not love, who was also in love with somebody else, was not a very happy one. Actually, Consuelo's husband told her right after their marriage that he only married her to save Blenheim Palace, which was his family's ancestral home, and was very much in need of a large cash influx. And that is what Consuelo had. As a wedding gift, her husband was given what would be today $75 million worth of railroad stock from the Vanderbilt. So that was the cash infusion he needed. And Consuelo seemed like she should have been a really good prospect. She was known to be very, very beautiful. She was intelligent and actually was quite successful as a duchess. So any lingering doubt over whether or not, this new money American heiress could really hack it in that upper echelon of society, yes, she could. She was known for being very charitable. She was an absolute hit in high society. She just wasn't very happy with her husband. Now, ultimately, they did separate. They even had their marriage annulled. And Consuelo did go on to marry for a second time and was fortunately much, much happier the second time around than in the first time. So there are an enormous amount of similarities so far between what we're seeing with Gladys Russell and her mother and what happened in real life with Consuelo Vanderbilt and her mother Alva. So only time will tell as the episodes come out if they are going to go so far as to really model Gladys's storyline on the story of Consuelo Vanderbilt, but it certainly seems to be shaping up that way. So I'm in Central Park right now, and this was not a setting for a scene that we actually saw in episode 5, but it is a setting that was referenced. So Oscar Van Ryn has a new friend in the Russell household to help him spy. Essentially, he wants to be kept abreast of everything that's going on regarding Gladys Russell and what's going to be going on with any suitors she might have or any marriage prospects. And so he enlists the help of Turner, Mrs. Russell's lady's maid, and they meet on the street and they make an appointment to meet up in an hour so that they can discuss how they're going to move forward. And they mention this spot right behind me. So this is the Shakespeare statue, the statue that they're going to meet up at. And actually this would have been a really sensible meeting spot for them. This is right in the center of Central Park, but 61st Street is not all that far away, which is where they're both shown to be living. So in episode 5 of The Gilded Age, this is the very first time that we have ventured really outside of any part of New York where you are seeing very wealthy people live. So in essence, this is the first time we're seeing how the other half lives. And I think this is really super important because that's very much a part of the Gilded Age. People do tend to associate it with this very lavish wealth, but one of the hallmarks of the era was this massive income inequality. And so now we're seeing how really the majority of New York would have been living at the time, if you're not talking about the people on the Upper East Side.
1 minute I'm under arrest for receiving a letter from Archie, and now you're asking him to dinner.
She's right. What are we supposed to think?
We'd like to meet Mr. Baldwin.
Yes, it's time we met Mr. Baldwin.
You're pinching me.
Mrs. Armstrong, so she's the housekeeper in the Van Ryn household, and on her day off, you see her really very secretively going off to visit who we later find out is her mother, and this is very clearly in a different part of town. Now, they did not specify what neighborhood this was meant to be in New York, and there really weren't a lot of context clues to go off of based off of any particular immigrant group her mother would have been a part of, so we couldn't really make any real guesses other than from the opening shot of her entering this neighborhood when she's outside of the building. The alleyway and the style of that alleyway she's walking through very much looks like it could have been a part of a neighborhood like the Five Points, which does not exist anymore. While the Five Points doesn't exist anymore, what we do still have in New York City in abundance are former tenement buildings. So tenement style buildings are really what the majority of New York would have lived in at that point when you're not talking about very, very wealthy families. This would have been newly arrived immigrants, newly freed enslaved people. Many of them lived in what we call tenement neighborhoods. Now, The Gilded Age, this show, is set in 1882, and so you would have seen a relatively recent shift in what was going on with tenement housing at the time. At one point in time, there were very few rules regarding tenement housing, and the result was exactly what you would think it would be. In 1860, they did start to pass some regulations. One of the very notable ones is that apartments had to have a window in them. In the 1870s, they passed another set of tenement laws. So by the time The Gilded Age, the show is set, any newer construction would have been a part of what we called these new law tenements. And a lot of these laws were about fire escape access, how many windows, air shaft, airflow, the layout, how many families could live per floor, and things like that. Now, from what I'm seeing of the neighborhood that Mrs. Armstrong is visiting, and some of what the inside of the building looks like, it very much looks like it could be an old law tenement, but not exactly. There are some hallmarks in there that would have been more common with a new law tenement, some with an old law tenement. But whether you're talking old law or new law, you can actually find examples of both all throughout New York City to this day. So let's talk a little bit about Ward McCallister, who was played in episode 5. We see for the first time, played by the fabulous Nathan Lane. So this is one of those characters in The Gilded Age who is absolutely a real historic figure. I actually even mentioned him very briefly back when we were talking about episode 2. So the way he's been set up and he's being seen here is that this is the turning point for Mrs. Russell. If she's going to crack into New York high society, then this introduction to Ward McCallister, this lunch with Ward McCallister, is going to be kind of the first step. And so if you're watching this wondering, like, how accurate is this? Pretty accurate, actually. So Ward McCallister was actually not born in New York. He was from Savannah, so that accent Nathan Lane was doing was absolutely spot on.
I think you have a very good chef. French, of course.
Of course.
But he was a distant cousin of Mrs. Caroline Astor, the reigning Mrs. Astor of New York high society. And so via his relationship with Mrs. Astor and really sort of, he had this self-appointed position as being the gatekeeper of New York high society, kind of the person who said what was acceptable, what was proper, which was something he was very much aligned with Mrs. Astor on, but not just acceptable and proper behavior, who was acceptable and proper. He was the creator, along with Mrs. Astor, of something called the New York 400. And this is maybe something you've heard of before, but in a nutshell, the New York 400 was the 400 people, more or less, in New York high society that were comfortable, as Ward McCallister said, in the very best society, in the very best ballrooms. There is a common story that they came to the number 400 because that's how many people fit in Caroline Astor's ballroom. There isn't really a definitive answer as far as why the number 400. Caroline Astor's ballroom down on 34th Street did fit about 400 people, so it's possible that played into it. Another likely answer as to why the number was 400 was that Ward McCallister was also the creator of something called the Patriarch Society and the Patriarch's Ball. The Patriarch's Ball was a list of 25 leading men of New York high society, and for the Patriarch's Ball, each one of those men was instructed to invite a certain number of people to attend this ball, and that number, that total number of attendees for the Patriarch's Ball, also roughly equaled 400. But the New York 400 was not just a word of mouth thing. Actually, in the 1880s, right about the time that the show The Gilded Age is set, the New York 400 was a list, an actual physical list that was published in the New York Times. And so it was right there in black and white. Were you in or were you out? If you were not on that list, the likelihood of you being invited into Caroline Astor's ballroom, very, very low. And so that's what you're seeing here with Bertha Russell. Why she's so desperate for this to go well is because this could change everything for her. So far we've seen she can write checks and she can show up at some things, but she is not accepted into that very, very upper echelon. But if Ward McCallister gives her the green light, he might give the green light to, about her to Caroline Astor, and that could change everything. Actually, one of my favorite lines in that entire episode, because while Bertha Russell is not a character that is a real historic figure, like I said, she's very much based on several historic figures and I think really embodies the Gilded Age, but they actually make a comment, oh, they're getting along so well. And Aurora Fane's husband said, why wouldn't they? They're basically the same person. And I think that's really true. Ward McCallister really made his whole identity about being this gatekeeper and who's in and who's out. And that's clearly something that Bertha Russell is very fixated on as well. I do think they're kind of two peas in a pod. And so only time will tell if this is going to be the leap into high society that Mrs. Russell is hoping for. But it seems like Ward McCallister likes her, so far so good.